from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am most pleased to welcome you to a 6-week series of programs that are entitled Empowering Women, Achieving Human Rights in the 21st Century. This series of TV programs comes out of a very, very major conference that was recently held at North Idaho College in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. This conference evolved out of an idea in 1987 by scholars in the United States and the Soviet Union in which they wanted to have what they call the Decade of Human Rights Conferences. And the real major goal of those conferences is to move us into the 21st century so that in history it will be known as the century in which human rights was achieved for all. And in those conferences, each one is emphasizing a particular area where we've had great problems and concerns, and this particular conference has, as I've indicated, stressed the issue of empowering women. In this first program, we're very pleased to have on the program the co-chair of this conference and one of the founders of this idea back in 1987, and I'm proud to say, when I met her 2.5 years ago, has become a very dear friend in our work in dealing with these issues. First of all, welcome to the program Dr. Riane Eisler, who is well known not only in the United States but around the world for her work. She's well published in both books and articles, and she has become really known for a remarkable work that took about 15 years to put together called The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future. She holds degrees from the University of California at Los Angeles in fields such as sociology and anthropology, and she holds a Doctor of Law from UCLA School of Law. Her resume is extremely long, but we want to talk about content, and so I will close with that and say to Dr. Eisler, it's a great pleasure to have you at this conference and to have you in our program. Welcome back to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
It's wonderful to be here and to be so welcomed.
And we're very pleased to have a second very distinguished guest who is also a great friend of Dr. Eisler. We welcome to Idaho Abida Kunum, who is originally from Pakistan. She comes to us with a very powerful story. She was one of several people that was in a small underground group called Women of Deliverance in Pakistan. During her years and work, she, with other women and men, risked their lives and livelihoods to carry a message of Planned Parenthood to the women of Pakistan and other causes. Because of her hard work, the end result was that she was arrested, she was beaten, she was raped because of her work for human rights and equality. She is now a political feminist refugee from her country living in Carmel, California. And Abida has also moved our delegates as well as Dr. Eisler with her message about empowering women, and I too warmly welcome Abida Kunum to our program.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
And I'm pleased to have our regular panel for this and all the programs we're doing on this subject. First of all is Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
Dr. Eisler, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to North Idaho. Can you tell us, this conference was your idea. Can you tell us a little bit about how it evolved and what you hope to accomplish with it?
Well, as Tony said, it really started in Moscow. It's a long stretch from Moscow to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, but I am delighted that this is where this conference is, because Idaho is heartland country. And this is really where I think people today are very, very interested in new perspectives, which are really very old perspectives in some ways, to make the world a safer and better place, which of course is a world where human rights are respected rather than chronically violated. The way it started is I was invited to come here, and out of the group of scholars that I belong to, had come this plan for a series of conferences. The 1993 conference is the subject of empowering women, achieving human rights in the 21st century. Tony Stewart, of course, is really the person who sparked it here. in Idaho. I spoke to him about it, and I said, how about here? Because, it is gorgeous here, among other reasons. And also because the fact is that the Kootenai County Task Force for Human Relations, it seemed who had been so courageous in, well, as Tony puts it, in not allowing hate to come into northern Idaho. It seemed so fitting that you host this international conference. That's the story of how it came about, except I want to thank, the three of you have been part of the organizers. The story is that hundreds of people, volunteers, have worked for 2.5 years to make it so. You ask me what I'd like it to accomplish. I think that conferences such as this are very, very important signposts toward the future. And I'll make 2 points about that. One, this conference in particular represents something that we must do, which is move towards an integrated model of human rights. Historically, the whole concept of human rights is a very new one, only about 300 years old. It started with the so-called rights of man movement. And believe me, that's what it was. There were women, of course. I mean, just as men were saying, wait a minute, we don't believe that kings have a divinely ordained right to rule in their castles, there were women in the 18th century who were saying, wait a minute, we don't think men have a divinely ordained right to rule in the, quote, castles of their home. But history has been written primarily by and about men until now. So that has gotten very much second place. And something very bad really happened to the human rights movement, something absurd, as a matter of fact. By splitting the so-called public sphere of economic relations between men and men, from which women and children were barred, from the so-called private sphere to which women and children were confined, the focus was entirely on what in my work I call the top of the dominator pyramid, not on the foundations. So we ended up with this total absurdity, which we have now still, of splitting off from human rights the rights of the majority as women's rights and children's rights. What this conference is about, what my work has been about for decades, has been formulating an integrated model of human rights. I've published in the Human Rights Quarterly one of the stage-setting, really, articles on this. My book, The Chalice and the Blade, from another perspective, does the same. This conference, which really deals with the centrality also of women's rights to any possibility of a world where human rights is truly respected, is a very important event, and we can talk more about that aspect.
Well, I want to ask a question also from Abida. Can you tell us, how did you come to be Abida?
Well, I came to realize that I was Abida only when I was cast off as being owned by nobody, by my father, my brother, my ex-husband, or my son. I was always connected to one of the relationships with men. But when I was Abida, I realized that I was Abida alone, speaking for many women of my country. And for that word, I mean, Abida was condemned for being out of her own system, to be unbelonging.
And who encouraged you? Where did you find the courage? How did you find the courage to be able to speak out?
My father was a Sufi, and I was born when he was 55. So he thought it was a symbol or a sign to bring me up as a woman who would not take abuse from any person. And he used to say, question everyone who mistreats you for being a woman child. And that's where it started. Of course, my mother warned me that there would be total disaster of this. And I did suffer a great deal doing this, trying to bring into other people's hearing what was happening to women in Islam as whole, not only the country of Pakistan, but in all Islamic countries. And that is where I started writing a book, Forgotten Hostages, Women of Islam. And that is about 36 case histories of women with whom I had worked, women in connection with birth, childbirth, and molestation, not divorcing, no rights for divorce. And that book is to me a very important sign of my whole life. At the present, I am in Carmel, and I'm working at a job which is plainly hourly paid. And so I don't find the time and the wherewithal to complete the book, but I have pledged to complete it, and I hope one day I will. I know Rayan because we co-authored a paean to be read out in Nairobi, and she was my spiritual guide and my friend in putting up the feelings that I had deeply embedded in myself. Women not only from my country, but from nearly all over the world. Women who were not recognized for what they were doing. So the paean was written with Rian, and it was read out in Nairobi, and was also performed somewhere in a church in New York. Bi-monthly, was it? I never got around to going any place to hear it, but today I had the chance of reading it out, and it was a long wish that I had come true.
Steve Sheen. Dr. Eisler, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the theories you've developed in your book and in other parts of your work about partnership and dominator models.
Thank you. I'd like to do that, but I also want to say something about Abida.
Please.
We live in an age still where Abida had a terrible time with immigration here because they wouldn't recognize the concept of a feminist political refugee. It was alien to them, and this is a struggle that's going on in the world today, where women are seeking asylum to flee from violence that is gender specific, that is not only against feminists who are trying to, of course, work to change very horrible. I mean, the things that Abida can tell about what goes on, it's heartbreaking, but also crimes that are gender specific, the so-called honor killings. I mean, of course, if you consider it honorable to kill your own sister, your own wife or mother for some suspected sexual infraction, why wouldn't you consider it honorable to kill strangers? Which takes me right to what you asked me, because I started off by talking about the need to integrate the so-called private with the public sphere. And my work has focused on that. There's some very obvious things. In the study that I did over several decades and that I'm still involved in, first of all, I used what I call a gender holistic approach. And what that means, and we have to invent new words because we aren't given them, is that we don't, like most studies, do really just the story of man or the study of man. We're so used to that. Of course, we're told that man includes women, but if you really read the books, we are immediately disabused of that notion because it is very male-centered, of course. And one of the things that I found, first of all, is that the way a society structures that fundamental relationship between the two halves of humanity, which is what women and men are, that's not just some secondary, quote, women's issue, the way we treat gender. It is central to everything in a social system, to its system of values, whether it's so-called, and I stress so-called, and I'll get back to that, feminine values, caring, caretaking, cleaning, can be given social priority or not, whether a system is chronically violent or not. And the other part of my work, and this is really ties in both with the Chalice and the Blade and my writing in human rights, is where do we learn and constantly practice either respect for human rights or violations of human rights. It's in our day-to-day relations, isn't it? And particularly our intimate relations, our sexual relations. So we're back to gender relations, our parent-child relations. And if we don't really focus on human rights violations that are, I mean, today we talk about, it used to be spare the rod and spoil the child, right? Today we know it's child abuse. It used to be if rape is inevitable, relax and enjoy it. Today we know it's a crime of violence. So-called domestic violence, which is kind of demeans it. You know, domestic, it sounds like it's not very important. They used to walk a man around the block till he cooled off. If he killed, you know, if he hit a stranger, he went straight to
Arrested.
jail. But if he hit someone he said he loved, so you see how we need to, and what's encouraging is how these issues are coming to the fore. And of course, in my work, I take a very systemic approach. I've introduced a new conceptual framework of what I've called the dominator or the partnership models as two basic human alternatives. And if we look at what's happening in our time, we can see that all the progressive social movements, you know, from the earlier human rights movement to the feminist movement to the ecology movement, which is, after all, against man's domination and conquest of nature, movements against racial injustice, etc., 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 peace movement, they're all movements against this dominator way of relating. And so the encouraging thing is that in bits and pieces, we are moving towards a different systems configuration, which I've called the partnership-oriented configuration. Not ideal society, but a society that doesn't need to systematically build in patterns of abuse and violence to maintain rankings, beginning with the ranking of one half of humanity over the other half.
Dr. Eisler, you talked about signposts, and I'd like to pose a question to Abida. When you, in his introduction, Tony said that while you were working with an underground movement advocating women's rights in Pakistan, I would like you to tell us a little bit about what conditions were like for women then, whether or not they have changed today, and what you see as a signpost in the future for women's rights in your country.
I think matters have become worse in a way. We're hoping that Bhutto comes back. She's back now and changes some of the system that is radical Islam. During my days, during Bhutto, her father's time, it wasn't so hard. But then suddenly it became the parda and everything was kind of suffocating. Women's rights were some things that are not even talkable. I couldn't even say the things that happened to women out there. It's just beyond belief. Physically, and of course mentally becomes a part that they endure, but physical abuse of women would be something I couldn't even speak of. And that was one thing that brought me out. As at signposts, I see a slow improvement. More women are getting up to say in my country that you really can't do this. At the time when I began, it was unheard of. Women would quietly go to slaughter. And I'm talking about the common women. I'm not talking about the educated masses. I'm talking about women from the middle class. But now, with more and more of the feeling, and some lawyers in our country, very fortunate speakers that have brought out the subject again and again at the threat of their own life, which I feel is sad. I'm not there still, but some of them have still spoken and spoken of the miseries. And it's a better situation in one way with the speaking out of the system. But the system governing the masses is Islamic, and that radical Islam, as far as I can see, does not hold any right for women to speak.
Thank you.
Abidal, we had dinner last night, and you and Rian and I had a wonderful evening, and I would call it of the human spirit. And I wish you would share, if you don't mind, with our viewers something that you said last night that I think would be tremendously helpful to many women and men who are viewing this program. And that is, what has this meant to you internally or personally, as you had to make some decisions? Your father, as you indicated, was a great influence, and you've paid a very high price from one sense of the word, but you have sown seeds that will...
The main thing that I marvel at is my awakening as such, and through all the suffering that I've been through, including the cancer and the spiritual not belonging anywhere in this country. And I have, by last night, but what you were saying, there were points that struck me as when I talked to myself saying those things, they didn't mean so much, but when I heard them from you, my spirit suddenly, after all 10 years of being alone, I hear a group of people talking like this, and the way you were expressing it, it was somebody else telling me, and my whole being and spirit flared up, and I said, that's what it means. That's whatever he's saying. It became totally something new. And that's what I was so excited about, hearing from you the source of what the Spirit makes you do, the encouragement, and how well you understood the whole theme. So that was surprising to me.
That is so pleasing to hear you say that, but it's very important for you to understand that all the struggles you've had and all you have planted seed that, as I said about Riane Eisler, that even beyond your lifetime will be part of this whole process of the 21st century, what we're talking about. Riane, I have read your works, and we've had a lot of dialogues, and I think that you have just done something that's absolutely remarkable from a historical perspective and all the data gathered. And I do want to say on the program that anthropologist Montague from Princeton University said a very powerful statement, and I think a very correct one, that he thought your work in looking at thousands of years of the relationship between human beings was the greatest work since the origin of the species. And I will say to the audience, TV audience, what I said earlier today, that I think history shall record that you've discovered something that will impact the planet. And in relation to that, I wish you would take us a little bit through the fact that when we talk about human rights today and empowering women, we often make the mistake of making the comment that we're moving into a new era and progress, when actually at one time that was actually reality, wasn't it? I wish you would take our viewers back over 5,000 years to where you discovered there was a partnership, and you're asking for a return. Is that correct?
I'm smiling because it's in 2 minutes or less, right? 5,000 years. But I'm really not asking for a return to any, quote, good old days. Because first of all, they were not ideal societies, but they were societies we are now discovering in our prehistory. Societies that flourished for thousands of years, that we know much more about now thanks to what the British archaeologist James Maillard calls a veritable revolution in archaeology, that oriented more towards what I've called a partnership rather than dominator model of society. What does it mean? They were more peaceful. There was less institutionalized violence, be it rape, child beating, wife beating, or chronic warfare. They were not male-dominant societies, and they were societies, therefore, in which the stereotypically feminine, the chalice, if you will, rather than the blade, could be the symbol of the highest power. I think that it's very important in relation to what Abida is talking about. We hear a lot about fundamentalism, but fundamentalism has very little to do with religion. I really want to stress that. Jesus, and I have a chapter in The Chalice and the Blade on so-called primitive Christianity, which is, of course, Jesus's Christianity. He basically preached stereotypically feminine values, nonviolence, caring, compassion, empathy, for which he was crucified and then deified, of course, which is how one gets rid of troublemakers. And then it got very co-opted. But the basis of so much of religion is the partnership model. And then it gets co-opted into rigidly male-dominant structures that exclude women, that are very violent, like the Inquisition, the Crusade, etc. But fundamentalism is about reinstating, whether it's Islamic or domestic, the leadership I'm talking about, because most of the people who are attracted to it are just, like so many people, confused, frightened. And this, they say, we know. We've got the direct telephone line to God, and nobody else knows. But what is it? Get women back in their traditional or subservient place. Let's have holy wars, lots of violence, lots of, let's get back to a family where women are the servants rather than partners. Even corporeal punishment is something that they think is just fine, many of the leadership. So we are, in their terms, really in a cultural war, but it's not about going back to dominator traditions. I think it's about, in that sense, reconnecting with our partnership roots, not to go back, but to go forward.
But I hear you saying that learn and from that early experience, tap that and build upon that. Is that correct?
Yes, because there's imagery and there is experience there that we need to tap into. And of course, if you look at history the way that I have tried to do, as a tension between these two possibilities, we can really see that a lot of what's happening in our time is not new, it's not radical. The human rights movement, yes, the concept is new because we have to get rid of the dominator model. But the notion that we humans don't have to have, quote, dysfunctional families based on control, this is part of the language today, that war is not inevitable in a time when the blade is the nuclear bomb and we can blow ourselves up, where man's conquest of nature is leading us to destruction, and that so-called women's rights, and yes, the empowerment of women, is essential if we're going to progress. These are all parts of the contemporary partnership movement, and it's very exciting for us here to be part of this. It's not going to happen by itself. Got to work very much to make it happen.
Thank you. Janelle Burt.
Dr. Eisler, I must commend you on such a positive and powerful message. It really is. Now, Abida, would you tell us very quickly, because I know we don't have much time, about a woman in your country who had 6 daughters and what happened to her?
Oh, she had 6 daughters, and it was one of the many women I came across. And she was pregnant again, so her husband and the mother-in-law, with the help of the brotherhood, that is the caste elders, were trying to abort the child. Somehow she believed that it was going to be a son, and she was so totally in disbelief that while she was bleeding heavily, she escaped to the family center, and she was hiding there, bleeding heavily and running a fever when we came upon her. And we helped her, we escaped with her in the car and took her to Hyderabad. That was the next station, the hospital. And we put her there, and me and my group took care of her and saw that she was healthy, and then she delivered a healthy baby, but again, it was a girl. The shock of it was so severe that Jamila totally lost her senses. She went around with a bundle of rags. It was awful to see her. And she would croon to it. She would say, "This is my son." She called it "man of my womb," and just carried it around because she thought it was the boy, and she would not believe anybody who said she had a girl. She said, "No, this is my son."
Abida, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I wish we could continue. I have the signal we're out of time. And on behalf of our panel and our staff, I want to thank both Abida Kunum and Dr. Rion Eisler for being on our first of our 6-week series. You have honored us with your presence, and you have been so informative. Thank you, and we wish you well.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week, and we'll do part 2 of this 6-week series on empowering women, achieving human rights in the 21st century. And we have outstanding individuals from throughout the United States and other countries that will appear on these programs. I would like to invite you to be with us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.